All right, good day, everyone. I'm Christian Espinosa, the founder of Bluebird Cyber. I'm here with Trevor Slattery. He's our CTO. Today, we're going to cover medical device penetration testing, a very important topic, and a topic that is, quite interesting because a lot of people are very confused about the differences between traditional penetration testing and medical device penetration testing. So we're going to cover those differences and what makes medical device penetration testing unique. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, throughout the webinar, you can feel free to type them in, and we'll display them on the screen and try to address them throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we can wait to the end. So feel free to comment as we're going, and we will display those as necessary. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Trevor. He's going to do most of the talking. So Trevor, are you ready? Ready to rock and roll?
Ready to rock and roll. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Yeah, this is a pretty exciting topic. It's become a little bit of old news at this point, but September 2023, the FDA really kicked up cybersecurity requirements, and penetration testing was part of it. So we're going to look a little bit about what those requirements are and how to make sure we're doing it right. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what is penetration testing. There can be a lot of misconceptions around this topic, so I want to clear some of those up. So penetration testing at its core is a way to identify a security problem in a system or a device. We're trying to simulate techniques and behavior of a malicious hacker using the same tools, the same research, the same procedures that they're doing so that we can mimic what would happen in an actual environment and more properly be able to prepare for it. So when we're doing a penetration test properly, it's done in collaboration with developers and manufacturers. The reason we're trying to pretend to be the bad guys is so that we can think how they think and do what they would do and spot the problems before they can. So if we identify a nasty vulnerability, we're doing this in an ethical way, working with the manufacturer so that we can inform them about the vulnerability, get it fixed up, and then verify that it's been fixed before we're pushing it out to the market. That's why the FDA wants to enforce this against new medical devices is this way, once they're fielded, all the vulnerabilities are hopefully shored up and attackers aren't going to be able to find a way in. Penetration testers are highly trained in core traditional cybersecurity concepts. With the FDA focus in mind, of course, they have to be very focused on regulatory requirements and development to make sure that they know what they're doing and how to fix it. It's one thing to know how to break a system, and it's another thing to know how to remediate a system once you have broken it. So one of the hallmarks of a skilled penetration tester is being able to understand not only what the problem is, but how to fix it and how to accurately convey that information to the client. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different types of penetration testing that we see commonly in this medtech space. Probably one of the more common areas is IoT or Internet of Things testing. This is very common with medical devices. It's when we're usually looking at a physical device. We're thinking of common physical protocols, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, RFID, Ethernet, or a USB port. All of these fall into that Internet of Things category. And essentially what we're talking about when we say Internet of Things is any smart device, something connecting to the internet. A smart fridge or a thermostat could be an Internet of Things device, or maybe a pacemaker, maybe a patient monitor. It's a pretty broad umbrella, but the testing principles are all going to be the same against these different interfaces. Of course, there are different regulatory requirements per industry, but they're all going to have similar protocols and similar hacking techniques when we're trying to penetration test them. The next very common one that we see a lot is going to be web application testing. This is common in SAMD products, and it's when we're looking at common web application technologies. The techniques will be similar to a standard web application penetration test, just looking at any standard website or web app out there. However, of course, the focus is going to be different, and we're going to get a little bit more into the details of what that focus is here in a second. The main distinction is just that we're looking at those web technologies. So everything is virtual, hosted up in a cloud somewhere. There's no physical device that we're interacting with. And this is going to be more traditionally what people are thinking of when they think of a hacker. Another thing that we'll see a lot in the medical device space is hardware testing. It's similar to IoT testing, but typically when someone says hardware testing in reference to penetration testing, they're talking more about the underlying components, embedded systems. We're looking at a lot of debug ports like UART and JTAG. We're looking at trying to do fault injections on the chip itself. This is very low level. This is probably the lowest level of testing that you can do, getting right inside of the device. It's worth noting that oftentimes this is going to be a very difficult test to execute because you have to first access these components, and that may not always be the easiest thing to do. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be super common for a medical device, but it's still worth noting as it's very common in the medical space, and that is network testing. So when we're looking at network testing, that's focused on testing internal networks that allow devices, components, computers, X-ray machines, MRI machines, all to talk to each other. This is extremely common in hospitals and other healthcare environments, and especially with the prevalence of electronic medical records, devices that can connect to the internet. Going back to that Internet of Things, this is very, very important. While this is not necessarily going to be an FDA requirement, this is a HIPAA requirement to make sure that you're doing proper network penetration testing. One thing that I really want to talk about, and this is probably one of the biggest gray areas and areas of confusion with the current guidelines, is a medical device versus a standard penetration test. Standard penetration tests are looking for different goals compared to a medical device test. And so we have to do a little bit of different techniques to meet these goals. So medical devices are tested using very similar techniques as other systems, but we're pursuing different goals. Now, what I mean by that is there are only so many ways to hack into a Bluetooth interface. There are only so many ways to hack into a web application. So to make sure that we're staying with that cutting edge of hacking techniques, we're focused on just industry best standards for hacking in general. We're not trying to do specific hacks targeted towards a medical device. We're doing specific hacks targeted to the device itself. Doesn't matter if it's a robotic device, an automotive device. The Bluetooth interface is going to be compromised in similar ways regardless. Now, having said that, we're trying to pursue a different outcome if we're looking at a medical device. A standard penetration test is focused on the CIA triad. That stands for confidentiality, or keeping sensitive information a secret; integrity, ensuring that nothing has been tampered with or modified without permission; and availability, ensuring that we have reliable uptime for a device or a service. While these are still very important metrics to go by and very important things to target during a medical device penetration test, there are a couple more things we have to consider, namely the potential for patient harm and the potential for protected health information loss. That's usually going to be our main focus when we're performing a medical device test. Can we hurt someone? Can we disclose protected health information? And this is what the FDA is primarily concerned about as well, in addition to many other regulatory bodies when we're focusing on this penetration test. So while the other metrics, the CIA triad, will still apply, there's a broader scope of what we have to cover and a little bit of a shifted focus, which is very important to keep in mind during this penetration test. That's why it's very important to go through a firm that is experienced in medical device penetration testing as opposed to a standard penetration testing firm. They may not be as experienced with focusing on these alternative targets and may not be able to get the exact same results that the FDA is going to expect. Now, of course, since this is all tied to regulatory requirements, we would be amiss not to talk about some of these regulations. Medical devices have to adhere to a couple different standards when we're talking about the penetration test. Namely, for the testing side of things, this will be ISO 27001 and NIST Special Publication 800-115. ISO 27001 is general security lifecycle, and so it's about security management overall in a device, in a network, in an organization, but it talks a little bit about what we need to do as far as that testing timeline and process, and we'll get more into those details in a minute here. NIST Special Publication 800-115 talks more about the actual specifics of what we have to do for testing, the requirements for documentation, what we're looking for, things like that. Now, in addition to that, we have IEC 62304 and IEC 81001-5. These are more focused on the general life cycle of cybersecurity in a medical device, with 62304 being focused on general medical device lifecycle, software development, product development, security baked in. And IEC 81000-1 or 81001-5, is focused on, it's meant to be sort of a global standard for medical device cybersecurity. Doesn't work that way in effect more often than not, as each different country has its own regulations and requirements. But that is the general purpose, is to be an overall widespread medical device cybersecurity regulation. Now, in addition to the targets, we have different documentation requirements. Medical device penetration tests need to be very in-depth and they need to follow the documentation requirements outlined by NIST Special Publication 800-115. We're going to take a look at what those actual requirements are in a second here so that you can make sure you're getting all of that included when you're performing a test against your device. All right, we're going to look more at some of those key standards, ISO 27001 and NIST Special Publication 800-115. A little bit of a tongue twister. So like I alluded to before, ISO 27001 is requirements for implementing an overall information security system in an organization. It's broad, it covers a wide scope, and it covers a lot of information. So it's not going to drill into the deep details on how a penetration test needs to be performed. What we are looking at here is a lot of the controls, things that we need to make sure are implemented, proper encryption controls, data masking, proper authentication, authorization. All of these are critical to have in a medical device, especially when we're dealing with sensitive information. When we're moving into NIST Special Publication 800-115, this is the actual process that we should adhere to during a penetration test. This outlines the documentation requirements, the planning, how we're actually executing the test, how we're preserving data, making sure that sensitive data gathered during a penetration test is kept safe and secure, properly disposed of after. Everything around the technical in and outs of the penetration test are covered under this standard. All right, now we're going to get into some of the testing documentation. A lot of penetration tests are just going to provide a test report. While many industries this may be acceptable, the FDA and medical device testing is unfortunately not one of them. So when we're looking at what we need to do for this documentation requirements, the first thing we need to develop is a test plan. Test plan is saying what we're going to do before we do it. It's the detailed steps that we plan to take, the tools we plan to use, any human or material resources we've been provided with, and then we're talking a lot about what we're going to test. It's very important that we talk about the experience of the penetration testers. We make a keynote of their independence from the organization. This is a very important thing to have a distinction there, as it is required that penetration testing is done by an independent third party. It cannot be done internally. So we're talking about everyone that's going to be involved in the penetration test, every tool, every system, as well as what we're testing. This is one of the resources that we have. The device itself and any accessories or credentials that we are provisioned are part of our resources. So this is mapping out everything before we go in and actually do it. Next thing, we're looking at the test cases. The test cases are going to be the actual attacks that we're performing against the device. So we'll take an example. We'll say that we have a phone. Phones have Bluetooth, they have Wi-Fi, they'll have NFC, they have USB ports, and some phones may have an audio jack. So we're taking a list of all of these different interfaces, the touch screen on the phone, these different testing points, the operating system, and we're trying to think, okay, what can we do to these different interfaces? What can we do to these different testing points? We'll develop a list of the test cases. So this is going to be the actual attack we're trying to do. For an example, if we're looking at a Bluetooth interface, we'll say, well, what if we can listen to the Bluetooth connection in the middle and it's unencrypted? So that'll become a test case, unencrypted Bluetooth. And we'll talk about what steps we're going to take, what tools we're going to use to prove that we're following a standardized procedure to test this Bluetooth interface, make sure that we're understanding what can go wrong there, and then verify whether or not it can go wrong. Finally, we move into the test report. This is after the testing is all said and done. We take a look at any of our test cases that were failures. So if we have a failed test case, that means we were able to compromise the system through that vulnerability. There were no controls in place to prevent that test case from being valid. That'll get written up in the report. We'll also want to talk about any of the test cases that were passed. That's a sign that controls were already in place. And again, it's a reminder that we were thorough with the penetration test. It's very important to make sure that you note everything that you're covering during this test, as well as the actual outcome of what you see during these test cases. So when we have a failed test case, of course, the next step is going to be to remediate it. Once it's remediated, we have to go in and verify that everything is remediated. So we're going to generate the final report, which talks about any remediation in place. This can be a little bit of a cyclical process. As part of our retesting, we want to see if we can bypass any fixes. Sometimes a certain control may be half implemented or implemented incorrectly. And if that's the case, it may be possible for us to work our way around it and compromise the system a little bit further, even though there's a little bit of a control in place. So we want to verify that's not the case. and help the developers understand best practices for fixing it right the first time around. But of course, if there is something that goes wrong, we want to make sure that it's fixed right after the fact and we are not able to exploit it before we create that final report. All right, now we'll look a little bit about the sequential order of a penetration test. So, of course, the first thing is we're doing that test planning. We're getting the plan and the resources for the test. That stems us directly into that test case development. So, determining what we can do that can lead to vulnerabilities. And then the first step of the actual test is going to be that reconnaissance. So, before performing the actual exploits, we want to gather as much information as we can about the device. Under the medical device context, this is often going to be a white box approach. And what that means is that we're provisioned a lot of information, the source code with the device, lots of documentation around it. So we're gathering in all of this information to understand the device as much as we can and have some more targeted testing. If we are not given that level of access, we're going to have to get this information ourselves. So there are a lot of tools out there, depending on the device, depending on the interface, that are going to bring in a lot of information about what security controls may be present, what different components are in use, things like that, that can give us a better idea of what we can do to compromise the system. Finally, once we've gathered all of that information, we want to perform these attacks against all of the mapped components that we've identified. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky area, understanding what the mapped components can be. We need to know what is in scope and what is out of scope for the test. Different regulations have different requirements as far as how deep you need to go. In general, for the FDA, it's a matter of how convenient is it to access something. If you have to physically dismantle and destroy a device, it may be out of scope. However, if there's something right out there on the surface, it's obviously going to be something that we need to test, as an attacker will get that easy amount of access. A general rule of thumb is if trying to access the component to test will leave extensive evidence that someone has broken into the device, that's likely going to be indication enough that that component is safe and has controls around it in the form of physical shielding. Once this is all done, we go into that reporting. So we talk about what we found, and it has to be in a very clear to understand report. It's often said that a penetration test is only as good as the report that is provided. Doesn't matter how much we can do as far as exploiting the system if we can't talk about how we did it and how to fix it. The remediation is the most important step here. So when we're generating this report, it should be in a very easy to follow manner. We should have our resources available in the form of our testing team to discuss what's going on, talk about some mitigations, understanding the different drawbacks of implementing this fix as opposed to that fix with the development team, and make sure that we're coming to a good solution where the device is secure without compromising functionality. Once these controls are in place, we go into that retesting phase, validating that everything is sufficient and we aren't able to bypass these controls, as I mentioned earlier. All right, now this is another area that can draw a lot of confusion. Some of the different testing components. So we're going to talk about the penetration testing umbrella here. There are a lot of different testing requirements. You have to do requirement testing, biocompatibility testing, software verification, validation, many different more areas when we're covering a full FDA submission. However, under this scope, we're looking at penetration testing, this sort of attempting to compromise the system. The first thing that we're covering here is a vulnerability assessment. Oftentimes, there can be a confusion between vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. So vulnerability assessments can often be thought of as a little bit more of an automated process. It's a lot of automated scanning to look for low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities. Out-of-date packets, severe misconfigurations, things like that will often be caught by vulnerability assessments. These are usually going to be used with industrial grade scanning tools, things that are trained on a lot of vulnerability data and try to spot out these patterns. Now, one problem with this is since these are looking for patterns and they aren't necessarily looking for impact, these are prone to false positives. So when we're going through a penetration test, a vulnerability assessment report can have hundreds or even thousands of findings, of which only maybe 60 to 70% may be applicable. So that is one thing to keep in mind when we're running vulnerability assessments, is they are prone to false positives. The next thing that we're looking at is penetration testing. Typically, the vulnerability assessment can feed directly into the penetration test, as that vulnerability assessment can act as part of that reconnaissance that we mentioned in a sense. It points out these low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities that we don't know if they are true positives or not since we haven't verified them, but it acts as a good starting point for that penetration test. We'll go through the vulnerability assessment, start executing our tests against what it identified to verify what's real and what's not. And then this will also give us a little bit more information about the system so that the penetration tester can create more targeted, specific attacks. Targeted complex attacks are very often going to be missed by vulnerability assessments, especially when we're looking at Internet of Things. There aren't many great scanning tools that are going to spot vulnerabilities in these physical components. So this is when the expertise of the penetration tester becomes very critical. Understanding how to compromise all these different interfaces can take a lot of research and a lot of training, and it has to be done as a manual process. But luckily, penetration testers have gotten pretty good at hacking, and the goal is hopefully to be better than the bad guys at hacking. So when we're doing this penetration test, we're getting all this information we have and doing very targeted, specific things to try to get maximum exploit value out of a single vulnerability. The next thing that we look at is fuzz testing. Fuzz testing is something required by the FDA. And what it can essentially be thought of is throwing a massive amount of junk data at different input fields or different connections to see if it'll respond in a strange way. This can be just sending different length strings starting from 1 up to 100,000 into a single input field and see if it eventually crashes to indicate there's a memory problem. Or sending malformed data into a certain interface to see if the application responds in a weird way or doesn't respond at all, or if it even ingests the bad data. It's just seeing how a device handles a bunch of strange connections to make sure that it's properly rejecting bad information. So this should be done against any input fields or any connections with massive amounts of data. Ideally, we're able to send hundreds of thousands, or in some cases, even millions of requests against all these input fields, against all these connections to really test and make sure that we have verified there aren't going to be any problems. The next thing that the FDA talks about under this penetration testing umbrella is vulnerability chaining. Now, this is a very important thing to look at. We're trying to see if we can combine several vulnerabilities to create an impact greater than the sum of its parts. So if we're able to exploit a system by finding a medium vulnerability and then we find another medium vulnerability, it may be possible for us to tie them together to create a high vulnerability. So when we have all of these initial findings put together, if we see that they're affecting similar components or work in a similar fashion, we might be able to do one after the other to create a bigger impact. It's very important to understand how deep the rabbit hole can go and exactly what the compromise could be if this were to happen. So that's what we're looking for when we talk about vulnerability chaining. The next very important thing to go over is a risk matrix for a medical device. Now, we talked about this earlier, but we're looking at different things when we need to cover a medical device as opposed to a traditional penetration test. That traditional penetration test is looking at confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which we can see that mentioned here in the bottom left corner. Now, here's an example of a medical device risk matrix that is catered more towards what the FDA is looking for. We're focusing on the potential for patient harm and patient data loss as that main impact. When we're looking at this risk matrix right here, that's going to be the x-axis when we're looking at minor to significant, having any definition from some slight inconvenience to the patient, maybe minor discomfort, all the way up to significant, which could even lead to patient death. The next thing that we need to talk about is how we're calculating an exploitability score and what that means. So often in a traditional cybersecurity assessment, you will see something like probability or likelihood of an attack being successful. These are subjective metrics, and they should not be used when we're talking about a medical device. And the reason for that is two different testers may come to a different outcome with subjective metrics. Based on their own personal experience and based on what they've done in the past, they might say, well, I think this is actually a 1 in 100 chance, while he thinks it's a 1 in 1,000 chance. And they're each going to have their own defensible position on it. When we're looking at an exploitability score, these are objective metrics. Any two testers should come to the same conclusion based on just certain facts that have to be applicable. Now, when we're looking at what the FDA talks about, they call out CVSS 3.0, which is a vulnerability scoring system that has been around for a long time. It's very common in medical device assessments and in just general cybersecurity assessments. We're specifically looking at the exploitability factors. This brings us to the little chart on the left here, where we look at some of the severity and metrics that we consider. We'll see here there's an impact score and an exploitability score. That impact is saying what is the outcome, what is the impact of the vulnerability, which again, we're focusing a little bit more on patient harm here for our impact score. But it's very important to note this exploitability score. So we'll see right here in this example that it's saying it's a 2.2, and we notice that our scale goes from 0 to 4. We have all of these different metrics that we consider: attack vector, attack complexity, privileges required, and user interaction. A combination of these and the different values they can be assigned will give you a certain score, which determines from an objective method how easy it is to do an attack. When we're looking at attack vector, this is essentially the proximity to the vulnerability. Can this be done over the internet? So someone in Nebraska can compromise a device in Florida? Or does it need to get on a local network, or do you need physical access to the device? We're looking at a couple different levels of proximity to determine what different levels of access you're going to have, what different attackers are going to do that. If it's a physical device, it's often going to be someone inside the hospital or inside the network trying to get to that device, where if it's over the internet, it could be anyone. The next thing we're looking at is the attack complexity. What that essentially means is, are there any circumstances that are out of the attacker's control? Is there anything that they cannot be responsible for when doing this attack? Oftentimes, this could be like a timing attack where there's a certain window that the attacker doesn't know, but they know that sometimes an attack works and they're just not sure why. So, in other words, it's just going to be an unreliable attack. This makes it less consistent and, as such, a little bit harder to exploit, and it'll have a lower exploitability factor. The next thing we're looking at is privileges required. This can be none, low, or high. No privileges will be just someone coming in unauthenticated. They don't have any access, any credentials. They're looking at it from the outside as the same anyone else would. Low privileges are just going to be a standard user account. This will be just normal level of access operating under just standard functionality. You don't have elevated privilege. You don't have access to any special functionality, just standard accounts. Finally, high levels of access will be full administrative permissions. You can change the device, you can access any administrative dashboards or sensitive functionality. This is the highest level of access, and usually these accounts are very well guarded. So if a vulnerability requires this level of access, it's going to be a lot harder to pull off. The final thing that we're considering for these exploitability metrics is user interaction required? An easy example of this could be a phishing attack. If someone sends you a malicious email with a dangerous link that's meant to steal your credentials, that email is great, but it's not going to do anything unless someone clicks on the link. So that's an example of something that requires user interaction. In a traditional cybersecurity vulnerability that's very common, especially against software as medical device products, we see cross-site scripting, where an attacker can embed malicious code into an application that triggers a certain action when a user views it. So that would be another example of something that requires user interaction. All of these factors go into understanding how easy or hard an attack is to execute. If there's something over the network where the attacker controls all the conditions under no privileges required, it's assumed that it can happen all the time and anyone can do it. If it needs physical access, high levels of permission, it's an inconsistent attack, it's a safe assumption that it's not going to happen very often. All right. Now, one thing I did want to talk about are some of the most common vulnerabilities and common pitfalls that we see during these engagements. One of, if not the most common vulnerability that we identify at Blue Goat during penetration tests is broken access control. So what broken access control means is that user accounts or user roles are not properly restricted from different sets of information. This would be the same as me being able to see Christian's email due to a vulnerability in Google. That would be a broken access control problem. Or if a standard account can access an administrator panel, that would be another example of that. This can be difficult to identify as vulnerability scanners, static testing tools, dynamic testing tools usually aren't going to pick this finding up. It requires a penetration tester to reference a whole bunch of different commands, a whole bunch of different states to see exactly what level of access is granted where. As vulnerability assessment tools, automated tooling usually isn't going to understand that's a problem. They'll just see, oh, there's this functionality here. We don't see a vulnerability in that functionality. They're not going to say, we shouldn't see this functionality at all. So that's a very important thing to look out for, and it's something that we see all the time. Another very common thing is security misconfigurations. So this is using improper or insecure settings on off-the-shelf third-party components, like a web server. The reason I bring up web server as an example is by default, a lot of web servers disclose information about what components are in use, information about the web server, and they leave it as server headers, which anyone can see on the open. Now, considering that a lot of software as medical device products use web servers for hosting, this is a very common problem that we see. Security misconfigurations, of course, can be a very broad umbrella of problems. However, this is an easy example and something that we'll see on most penetration tests against SAMD products. Another common problem in software as a medical device is insecure cipher suites. What this means is when you're trying to connect to a website, there are a list of different encryption protocols and cryptographic algorithms that are allowed for that encrypted connection, since any information you're sending to and from that website should not be readable in plain text. Now, if the server allows for insecure or previously compromised algorithms to be used, this is a problem. This means that there's a potential for an attacker to capture that information and decrypt it in the middle, or they can perform a timing attack to try to determine how the algorithm is being performed and then make some deductions based on what the information is inside of it. It's very important to shelter against these and use only known secure cipher suites. This is also a finding that is explicitly called out by the FDA as something that manufacturers should get out of the system as early as possible. It's not often a very complicated fix, but it is a very complicated problem. So it's one of those low-hanging fruit things to get rid of that definitely looks good for the FDA. Another thing that we see all the time is lack of authentication on physical interfaces. This is very common, especially with Bluetooth and RFID. A lot of these protocols will support optional authentication, but it's not included by default. And what that means is that the device connecting to it, we'll say we have a medical device and then an accessory, such as a remote. That remote can have a key that it authenticates to the protocol with. And if it's not set up, then anything can connect to that Bluetooth interface. So this is a best practice to implement. Make sure that Bluetooth authentication is enabled, RFID authentication is enabled, and in general, that authentication is enabled wherever it is possible. Another very common problem is information disclosure. Again, this is another very wide category. It just means that sensitive information is being bled out to an attacker due to a misconfiguration or due to potential mishandling of an error state. A lot of things can trigger information disclosure, but essentially all that it means is that bad guys know something they shouldn't. I mentioned two very common situations where there can be a misconfiguration. We'll look back at that security misconfiguration in a web server where it's talking about headers that are showing what components are in place. This can be thought of as both of these categories. It's a security misconfiguration leading to information disclosure. Another very common problem that we see is improper error handling. So if an application crashes, it'll say exactly why it crashed, talk about the stack trace that's coming out from the back end on the server, saying, hey, this is what happened to the server, this is the line of code that it happened, and that can disclose some information to the attacker. We want to give as minimal information as possible. So if the application crashes, it should just say an error has occurred and then maybe give an error code so that the development team can debug it or just not allude to anything at all. Another thing that we see is lack of control on physical interfaces. I would say this is most common with USB interfaces. They're just put into the device and then left as is. There are a lot of optional security configurations, even outside of authentication, which we had already gone over, such as device whitelisting, or you can put physical locks on interfaces even. The reason I bring up USB is USB has a lot of functionality. There are a lot of different applications, a lot of different ways to use USB. It could be used for charging, data transfer, updates, increased storage. There's a lot you can do with USB. So as a result, there are a lot of different ways you can attack USB, and there are a lot of things that should be done to try to restrict that. A common problem that we'll see is on a device, there will be a USB port that's intended for like an update, or it's intended for just data transfer, but it allows for executable devices to be put in, or removable media, or a mouse, or a keyboard, or a hot plug attack. There are a lot of different things that it allows when it should only allow for that data transfer or for that update package. So what we want to do at that point is say, hey, we know what this device is. This is a certain USB flash drive that has that update package. We're only going to allow this USB flash drive We're not going to run anything that's on there. We're going to verify that that update package is legitimate when we plug it into the device. All of this needs to go into consideration when we're trying to secure a USB interface. Now, of course, this doesn't only apply to USB interfaces. The same can apply to an Ethernet interface or an HDMI interface. HDMI, well, typically thought of as just something to transfer video to a screen, can actually be used to control power on, power off different devices if certain protocols aren't disabled. And many of these protocols are enabled by default. So it's very important to keep this in mind when we're trying to harden a device. All right, I want to look at some of the key takeaways, and then we'll turn over and see if there are any questions available. So, medical device penetration tests focus on different impact factors than traditional tests. Again, we're looking at that patient harm and patient health information loss as the primary focus. Traditional tests are more concerned about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Cybersecurity requirements are guided by NIST Special Publication 800-115 and ISO 27001. Medical device testing documentation needs to be very comprehensive as per NIST 800-115. That's when we're looking at that test plan, the test cases, and the report, and making sure we're hitting the right level of detail in all those and the expected information. There can be many different types of penetration tests applicable to medical devices. We have IoT tests, web application tests, hardware tests, and in some cases, maybe even a network test for a network device. Not all devices can have the same types of testing. So if we have a physical device with only one interface, it's going to be a much different scope as opposed to a large web application device. Finally, penetration testing is a key step in identifying flaws and checking for controls once flaws have been identified. This should be a very important part of any risk management process and baked in early and often into the device.
All right, awesome. Great job, Trevor. You got it in early and often. I was waiting for you to say that. You always say that.
Yeah, I think that's got to just be my tagline. I got to get some shirts made.
Yeah. I thought we discussed one time we're going to get early and often on the front and something else in the back. I forgot what it was. So, all right, we'll see if we have any questions here.
Evil, that was it.
Necessary evil, early and often. That's right. All right, I have a few questions offline. I can type in my favorite people or out the window, the leaf blowers. It looks like we have a question here from Cameron also.
Curious to know if you dismantle a device when you test it. So that's a good question. It depends on how easy it is to dismantle the device, really. When I was talking about the hardware testing, we're looking at what can go into whether or not it's evident if you dismantle the device. So we'll take a phone for an example. If I want to get to the chips inside this phone, I'm very obviously going to have to break the phone. I'll have to snap off the screen or damage the back. It's going to be evident that I got to those chips. And so I'll probably say, hey, someone messed with my phone and not use it. Now, if there was just a little panel that you can pop off and that shows you all the internal chips, which is common with a lot of devices for easy maintenance, then it's under safe assumption that there wouldn't really be evidence of someone compromising the inside. Someone can get to those chips very quickly, very easily, and then get out without being noticed. So it just depends on how easy it is to access those internal components. Are APIs and mobile testing part of med device testing? In many cases, yes. So APIs in software as a medical device are super common, even with physical devices. Often there will be APIs calling to an update server or to an installation server. And then for mobile testing, a lot of medical devices come with like an accessory app, or some medical devices are only an app for your phone. So both of them are super common. We see them all the time. And they follow similar strategies and approaches to web application testing, of course, just targeting a little bit of a different interface. All right, what are the challenges on testing unique physical interfaces? I would say the biggest challenge is lack of research around them. So if we're looking at network testing or web application testing, there are hundreds of thousands of blogs, articles, courses, books on how to perform it properly. When we're looking at testing something like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, there's a lot less research done and a lot less security at the front of mind when it comes to these different interfaces. So a lot of manufacturers aren't aware that they're as big of a problem, and even a lot of penetration testers aren't aware that there can be so much that goes wrong with a physical interface like that. So that's probably one of the bigger problems that we'll see with these different interfaces. Our team spends a lot of time researching these interfaces, making sure that we're on the cutting edge of security with public research, what other hackers are doing, and then seeing what we can discover on our own, and fiddling around with a Bluetooth interface, seeing what we can come up with. Another area that can be challenging is these require a lot of different physical tools. So making sure that you're well equipped going into a penetration test. All of our testers have just crates of different tools and little plugs and cords and cables to try to interact with all these different interfaces. And sometimes you might realize, turns out that I don't have everything I need to test a Bluetooth interface, or it turns out I don't have everything I need to test Wi-Fi. So it's very important to make sure that you have everything on hand, you're prepared for any different interface, and you know what all that equipment needs to be. All right, what are some other testing requirements from the FDA other than pen testing? I'll admit that I'm not as experienced with like the biocompatibility testing and the human factors and animal testing, all those different things. But from a software and security perspective, there's a lot more that goes into it. So we'll first talk about security testing. We went over all of these different areas. We also need to do static testing as a requirement. Static testing is analysis of the code base by automated tooling to look for potential flaws. We need to do SBOM analysis. So SBOM analysis, the software bill of materials, that's running over all of the third-party components used in the source code to see if there are any vulnerabilities there. And then another area that the FDA calls out is very important for the security testing side of things is software or security requirement testing. So when manufacturers are developing a device, they're going to create the requirements for the device, which are the functional requirements are going to be, what does the device do? That's going to lead into the non-functional requirements, which are, how does the device do it? Part of those non-functional requirements will be security requirements. How does authentication work safely? How does data storage work safely? So for any of these requirements, there should be a test built in to verify that the requirement was properly implemented. Moving into broader requirement testing that goes into the software side of things for FDA requirements. There are a lot of different software documents that are needed, a lot of software testing, and a lot of that is going to be verification and validation testing to ensure that every requirement that was derived for the device has actually been implemented in the system.
Awesome. I think we have one more question that came in offline, so I'm going to display this one, and we'll see if we have any other ones that come in while you're going over this one.
Are there any specific pen test certifications required, like CEH, OSCP, etc.? And what do I recommend? Not CEH, we'll start there. For required penetration testing certifications, the FDA hasn't published any explicit rules saying you need to have XYZ certification to be an FDA-approved penetration tester. So ultimately, I would say there isn't any strict requirement around it. Part of the FDA requirements are proving the tester's expertise. So talking about how many years of experience does the tester have, certifications are obviously a great way to do that. As far as what I recommend, there aren't too many great certifications out there for Internet of Things testing. There are a lot of courses available. I know like the Cyber Mentor has a great course on Internet of Things testing. And then there are a lot of different resources available just on the internet to try to get into it. There's a book, which I have over there, called Practical IoT Hacking. That's really good for brushing up on this side of things. But as far as certifications, I would say a certification like OSCP, something that's just on general core penetration testing concepts, one of these beginner certs that really looks at everything from a wide level, can be really good just to understand the penetration testing process. Moving into some of the more specialized certifications, I would say a bigger focus should probably be on a web application certification, such as the CBBH or the OSWE. Those are focused on a lot of the common SAMD technologies that we're going to use, and less focused on something like red teaming, which most certifications I would say are focused on red teaming or like Active Directory testing, network testing. All those are great skills to have. They're not as applicable to a medical device. So with certifications, it's a little bit of a trickier topic.
All right, awesome. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we'll wrap up here. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope you found the webinar valuable. It is a confusing topic to people. Hopefully Trevor, I think he did add some clarity around the topic. And be sure and tune in next month. for our next monthly webinar. I'm not sure we know the topic of that one yet. Do we, Trevor?
Yeah, I think we'll have to put our heads together and come up with that. So look out for the news on LinkedIn, and yeah, looking forward to it.
Super. Well, thanks everyone. See you next month.